Detailed explanation of the meeting of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee Section 4. Yes, it can basically account for 10. 10 is not a small amount. However, I would like to say this. This 10% is a very magic number, and later we will find another area is also 10, so we can know what their legislative logic is. But what would I think? I would argue that the marginal benefit of replacing old consumer goods is diminishing. What does that mean? When you first introduced this policy, it would stimulate some people in the society who want to consume but need some price incentives to do so. But as time goes on, the number of people who have the money and the will to do this gradually decreases. In fact, I don't think he will play. Consumer goods have been replaced with new ones. The effect of the first 2 months has been very good, and the effect of September and October this year is very good. By November, the effect will not be so good. If we continue this path next year and depend on this matter, we will continue to do it for a year next year. I think in fact, the effect of next year is problematic compared with this year. And even if next year to 600 billion does not mean that the intensity of the increase, because this year starts in the second half, 300 billion, right? Doubling 600 billion next year is only to spend the second half of this year's quota in next year. Because the time is also extended. So in fact, the overall increment is basically unchanged. That is, there is no huge incremental change, and I think the editing benefit is diminishing. If they use this method to boost domestic demand next year, the effect will not be better than this year, because the editing effect will be diminishing. Well, that's money for 2 hearts, but what about money for 2 hearts? Double money is fencing, and fencing money has 2 parts. Part of it is the $700 billion in this ultra-long-term treasury bond that is doubled to $1.4 trillion in ultra-long-term treasury bonds. There are also special bonds, leaving 3.7 trillion yuan of money, so we can even use this money to invest. On 3.7 trillion plus 1.4 trillion, the increment is 5.1 trillion, so there can be 5.1 trillion more money on infrastructure next year. What is this 5.1 trillion? Why do I say magic number? Just now we have seen the total amount of fixed asset investment in 2023.50.97 trillion, that is, 510 trillion, which is just 10% of that amount. Alas, so whether it is 2 hearts or 2 the money of 2 hearts if the equivalent period is pulled, basically 2023, the 10% of the retail consumption of this society and the 2 kinds of infrastructure money are basically 10% of the fixed asset investment in 2023. So we get it. The country is basically 10% by 2023 in the projected 2 stars and 2 middle money. Why is it 10 out of 10? So this one can imagine, 10 times in 2023, that's about 2025. The GDP growth rate is 5% because 5% this year, 5 next year, so let's be clear, what kind of money is 2 hearts? It's 5% of GDP, so the entire scale of this fund, he was able to maintain 5% growth in fixed asset investment and retail sales of consumer goods. The money in the middle of this number is good money for 5. I just got money from 2 people. Here's the money. I think I will not be so optimistic next year, because this trade in according to the same amount of editing, the benefit is diminishing. Where's the money from the 2? I will introduce you to a small detail, that is, why the special in the ultra-long bond is different. What about this super treasury bond? Is this money to be paid back? This special bond has a special point, and I hope it can be used as more capital when I invest in infrastructure next year. What is used as capital is not to account for the credit of the project. And the government will enter the high-speed rail and high-speed inside by becoming a shareholder. This has an advantage, that is, it will not increase the pressure of compounding interest rates. And it will not increase the pressure of compounding interest rates, but in fact, it is very difficult to find a suitable project for this part, and China has proposed this special project as project capital for a long time. But in fact, the promotion of the local is relatively slow. This year on the fencing issue will encounter a problem. That is, if fencing, China also faces a dilemma. If you have to strictly approve projects. China really does not have too many infrastructure projects to build. If you want to raid, spend all this money, you have to repair many repetitive construction projects, so this is not very useful. Well, I came back to say 2 hearts on let's say a summary of 2 hearts on it is to protect 5% of the money, is to protect 5 money, but is it good for the economy? I don't think it's good for the economy, how much money we're throwing at 2 people. Look. The investment is 3.7 trillion yuan of this special bond and 2 trillion yuan of ultra-long-term treasury bonds, so a total of 5.7 trillion yuan of money. That $5.7 trillion is a lot more than the $1.3 trillion added to the deficit. But I don't think it's for the right reasons. Why isn't it local? First of all, we have to look at 2 kinds of 2 kinds are free of the most expensive part, the money of these 2 kinds. I think it's basically duplication. It is now the way that China continues to rely on infrastructure for fixed asset investment, no matter what high standard farmland it engages in, what kind of logistics centers, what kind of high-speed rail highways. This is never built. This is to take the old road after 2008. This we have enough of the program. Therefore, it is actually a continuation of the old road, but it will make China's problems more and more serious. And it is really meaningless to continue to invest a lot of money in this field. 2 stars is this, especially in the field of consumer goods trade-in, so now our country should do consumer goods trade-in. I don't think so. Why not this year? We have a project to curb industry overcapacity in many areas, such as new cars. The state is still doing subsidies. Is this furniture inside the volume or contain the volume? May I ask whether subsidies encourage the price war of enterprises or curb the price war of enterprises? That subsidy is of course the price war of furniture, because the state uses subsidies to exchange old for new, which will make consumers more sensitive to price, right? What should companies do now that consumers are more price sensitive? Of course, it is to further lower the price, plus the subsidies of the state to compete, effectively to compete. It's less market share than it would have been, so it's going to hurt profitability in the long run. Just this year, the gross profit margin of white electricity enterprises and the gross profit margin of automobile enterprises are actually difficult to control. So the matter of 2 hearts is fundamentally in conflict with the containment of internal volume. And I think this will lead to the continued misallocation of resources in the whole society. That is, should the resources of our society really be invested in the field of white electricity and new energy vehicles, which are already very serious overcapacity? If it should not, the country's consumer goods will be new. Why is it mainly to these 2 areas of slag? Therefore, I think that the 2 stars cannot contain the internal volume, but also lead to the continued mismatch of national resources. So this incremental funds are mainly invested in the 2 stars and 2 double, which is based on the guarantee of 5.